Hello and welcome. My name is Kyle, also known as Alientude, and I'm here today with some thoughts on the Windlass D-Guard Bowie knife. Despite that name, this blade could be considered a short sword. It's made by Windlass Steelcrafts, one of the most prolific makers of budget swords in the market today. Founded by Mr. Ved Prakash Windlass in 1943, they make their blades in India and ship all across the world through a wide variety of retailers. In the US, the primary retailer for Windlass is Museum Replicas, which they also own. Windlass also does a good amount of contract work for other brands. For instance, many of Cold Steel's swords are made by Windlass. Let's talk about the reputation Windlass has developed for themselves. Please keep in mind this is my interpretation, combining my personal experiences with what I've gleaned from other people. I'll try to be unbiased, but it's certainly possible that I'll fail at that goal. So as I said earlier, Windlass is a supplier of budget swords and knives. They offer a wide variety, ranging from medieval to Renaissance to fantasy to Civil War. Generally, they use 1065 high carbon steel, although some of their shorter blades are made from 1055, like the D-Guard Bowie in this video. When it comes to historical accuracy, Windlass is typically a bit on the lackluster side. Most of their swords lack much, if any, distal taper, and hence tend to handle differently than the swords they're inspired by. Still, they're pretty widely regarded as a good entry point to the sword collecting business because they generally are heat treated correctly and have decent enough handling. Now keeping in mind that I'm not a historian, the D-Guard Bowie I'm reviewing seems to be inspired by knives carried by some soldiers in the United States Civil War, possibly more commonly by Confederate soldiers. I found this picture from African American Faces of the Civil War, link in the description, that shows a similar blade held by Confederate Sergeant Andrew Martin Chandler. So Windlass's version of this Bowie straddles the line between large knife and short sword. There's no specific definition of when a blade turns into a sword, so I think it generally comes down to opinion. The length of this blade combined with the almost saber-like D-Guard leads me to classify it as a short sword. It normally retails for just under $125 US, although I bought this one from Therian Arms for $90. Looking at the hilt, the grip is made from wood with a light stained color. Windlass doesn't specify the type of wood, just that it's hardwood. It's capped with a steel ferrule that has some small ledges at the junction with the wood. Luckily, these ledges are small enough that they don't bother me in use. The shape of the grip is only slightly elliptical, with a flare towards the end. That flare, combined with the weight of the D-Guard, helps index the blade, making up for the fact that the grip's cross-section is not particularly conducive to indexing. All in all, it's an effective design, and I don't have any issues knowing where the blade is or where it's going. The wood is smooth, and while it's not slick, it does feel like my hand could slide around if I'm not careful. The flare helps with that, but I think I'd prefer if the grip were a little shorter. It feels just a bit too long for my average-sized hands. The guard starts at the base of the grip and curves around, forming the D shape and continuing past the grip, forming a quillon that's a little upswept. The guard is peened to the tang, and the peen is one of the sloppiest I've seen. Relatively little effort was done to clean it up, but at least I don't see any errant hammer marks. Aside from the sloppiness of the peen, the guard is well formed. When held in the hand, the D-Guard is plenty large enough to not scrape my knuckles or anything like that. It should provide some extra hand protection, and I think you could even use it to accentuate a quick, unexpected punch. The gap in the guard where it meets the blade is fairly large because it doesn't conform to the grind. If Windlass had wanted to reduce the gap, they would have made the slot narrow to match the blade as it thins towards the edge. For the low price of this sword, this gap isn't a problem, and it's nice not to see a bunch of gunk in there. Like many Windlass blades, this comes with a leather sheath. This one has both a steel chape and collar. There's not a lot to say about it. It's leather and it's fine for keeping the blade safely tucked away, but the leather feels pretty cheap and the fit is poor. It's loose, and as you can see here, the sword doesn't fit all the way in. Still, it's better than not providing a sheath at all. Moving on to the business end, the blade. I took some measurements of it, and here's a comparison with the specifications according to Windlass. As you can see, everything gets pretty close to manufacturer's specs. The blade, as is typical for Windlass, doesn't really feature any distal taper, only narrowing with the false edge. For this short of a sword/knife, that doesn't really seem to negatively affect it, at least in my opinion. It's balanced at 3.5 inches, about 7.5 centimeters, and feels pretty agile, which you'd expect considering it weighs less than 1.5 pounds. The Bowie is finished in a near mirror polish, which is fairly typical of Windlass. It's a decent enough look, although I do prefer a full satin finish. Still, this one is nice and even, marred only by the Windlass Made in India mark near the crossguard. Windlass provides this sword factory sharpened, which is not typical for most of their blades, although recently it seems more of their blades come factory sharpened. Even though it was sharpened at the factory, it still features a secondary bevel. Unlike most aftermarket sharpening surfaces, however, this one is more of an appleseed edge, as opposed to a cruder, hard angle. This should help with cutting and provide good durability. The false edge isn't sharpened, but it narrows the blade enough that it should aid in thrusting, and I think it could be sharpened fairly easily. So talking about the edge naturally leads me to performance. I do have some old footage of me cutting with this Bowie. Please keep in mind I'm a complete novice when it comes to using blades, and failed cuts are usually the result of my poor technique rather than a faulty sword. Cutting pool noodles was quite easy, producing clean cuts most of the time. There were several poor cuts in here, but again, these are more my fault than the Bowie's. Water bottles produced pretty similar results. I wasn't able to cut well enough to leave the bottoms of the bottles in place, but the blade still cut through the bottles in a satisfyingly effective manner. Okay, so now it's time to talk bottom line. Is a D-Guard Bowie worth the price? Well, let's be real about that bottom line. This is a short sword that you can get for around $100 US bucks. It's very difficult to find anything that combines quality and functionality in that price range. When you're talking very budget blades, little fit and finish flaws and less attention to detail are easily forgivable. The lackluster sheath, the lack of distal taper, and the sloppy peen, these are things that would drive me crazy on more expensive swords, but for about $100, it's really hard to complain. So yes, I do think the Windlass D-Guard Bowie is worth the price. It's a lively large knife / short sword that's frankly just fun to use. I'm lucky enough that I can afford to buy high-end swords such as Albion's, but that doesn't mean I can't appreciate a good buy at an inexpensive price. Sword collecting can be a very expensive hobby, and blades like this one are an important entry point. I'm very happy with it, and also very pleased that Windlass is able to provide this level of quality for such a good price. I hope you enjoyed this review. Thanks for watching, and please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to my channel. Until next time, Alien Toot out.